everyone, and welcome to this new episode of An Ingenious You, the podcast where we speak with higher ed's most creative thinkers and doers. Today's guests hardly need an introduction. Eddie Maloney and Joshua Kim have been dubbed higher ed's most iconic duo. They are academics, co-authors of 2 books and many articles, and in their Inside Higher Ed blog about technology and education, they routinely have interesting and provocative things to say. Josh is the director of online programs and strategy at Dartmouth College, as well as serving as a senior fellow for academic transformation, learning, and design with the Center for Designs in Learning and Scholarship at Georgetown University. Eddie is a professor of English at Georgetown University, where he is the executive director of the Center for New Designs in Learning and Scholarship, a professor of practice of narrative literature and theory in the Department of English, and the founding director of the master's degree program in learning, design, and technology. We'll include full links to their bios in the show notes, but I have been very much looking forward to our conversation. Josh and Eddie, welcome to the Ingenious You community.
Thank you, Melissa. Great to be here.
Yeah, thank you, Melissa. Thanks for the lovely introduction. It's wonderful to be here.
Now, the two of you have become known for your writing and your speaking about learning innovation. I don't know how you feel about being dubbed as higher ed's most iconic duo, but I think that comes as a result of the fact that you have become very well known for your writing and your speaking and your thought leadership. You've collaborated on 2 often cited books, Learning Innovation and the Future of Higher Education, and The Low Density University, 15 Scenarios for Higher Education, as well as a host of other projects, as I mentioned. Josh, you have a doctorate in sociology and demography from Brown, and you're now at Dartmouth, whereas Eddie, you have a PhD from the Ohio State University in English Lit, and you are at Georgetown. So how did the two of you start working together, and how did you wind up in this learning innovation space?
I think Josh and I had intersected in a couple of different ways over the years, but we really started to work together around 2013, 2012, 2013, when we were all thinking about the kind of MOOC craze that was hitting higher education and what it meant for the future of higher ed, and this particular platform that was changing how we were thinking about online. Josh and I started working together and connecting around some of those questions as part of an edX partnership at the time that we were, both institutions were involved in. And that, I think, extended pretty quickly to, I think, just recognizing that we had shared interests. There were things that we were working on at both Dartmouth and at Georgetown that were similar, some challenges both with thinking about our institutional context, but also thinking about where higher ed was going, that I think really led to some initial engagements. We ran a symposia together, and then we started writing together. And from there, both books came pretty quickly, in fact. And in fact, they were published, came out in the same year. So we've been working together ever since. And we have 2 more books that are coming out very soon as well.
Eddie is often way too modest, and I'm always trying to get Eddie to be less modest. But the reality is that under Eddie's leadership, Georgetown has really become the center for a larger ecosystem-wide conversation about where teaching and learning innovation is going. So I had known of Eddie's and Georgetown's work for a long time, and the chance to work with Eddie at Georgetown is a great honor. And Eddie has also done an amazing job of bringing together other scholars at Georgetown and at Candles who are researching and now teaching through the master's program that Eddie and his colleagues have developed these issues. So I think that institutional part and the work that Georgetown has done is an important part of this story.
Yeah, thank you for that. And full disclosure, my daughter was a student of Eddie's, and so I have some firsthand exposure to just how significant the work is that's being done there, and how impactful Eddie and his colleagues are in bringing up the next generation of learning designers and professionals who are working in this space. So I'm right with you on that, Josh. So let me go back and ask you about your first 2020 book. And the first one is Learning Innovation, right? And the Future of Higher Ed. That was the first one that came out. And it was written before the pandemic, I assume. Yeah.
Yeah, that's correct. Yeah.
So, okay. So in the book, you provide a really valuable context for understanding the evolution of teaching and learning going back at least a couple of decades. And you use the term "a turn to learning," which I think is a really interesting term for describing what you observed. Can you walk us through some of the most important shifts that you document that constitute a turn to learning?
So I'll start and then let Josh jump in. And actually, I just thank you for the question and kind of go back to what I had said in terms of where we started working together. So the first turn to learning that we really mark and is this this moment where we saw across higher education maybe an anxiety, maybe a fear, a concern, but also potentially an opportunity for many to think about what was going to happen with higher ed now that we had technologies that enabled large scale engagement with students. And we can talk about whether or not that's actually learning. We can talk about whether or not that's actually a useful platform or approach to teaching and learning. I'm happy to have that conversation. But what we really wanted to mark in our book was that this was a moment where you saw presidents, you saw provosts, many who spend time thinking about the larger institutional context, which involves many, many things outside of teaching and learning, really shift their attention to a teaching and learning problem, maybe for the first time in a long time, and really to say, you know what, actually, we better pay attention to this thing that's happening around us. We've got people who are getting written up in the New York Times and in magazines saying there may only be 10 institutions of higher education by 2050. And so that anxiety was really starting to settle. We had presidents, we at least one president at an institution who was fired for not moving quickly enough in this space. That created a lot of pressure. And so we started to really see this moment where everyone recognized and realized, sorry, I have fire trucks outside my window in my office, started to realize that that teaching and learning is something that we do in higher education. And it's not just about research. It's not just about athletics. It's not only about providing a context for students to come and be part of this formative experience, but there really is value in thinking about this thing that happens in the classroom. And importantly, we saw at that time that there was a recognition that it couldn't just happen on its own, that there needed to be some understanding, some investment, some engagement in this, we needed to be intentional about this. And luckily, I think for higher education, we were doing a lot of that work. A lot of schools were doing that work. Schools that hadn't been paying attention to this for a long, long time were doing that work because of that MOOC moment when the pandemic hit. And so many were more prepared than they would have been. The technologies were more advanced than they would have been. Faculty were more willing to engage with some of these tools than they might have been 10 years ago if we hadn't had that. So good, bad, or otherwise, that actually, I think, was one moment where we turned back to a sense of learning. And we can look at others historically where that's happened as well, but we can easily map also those moments where we've turned away from learning. And for us, I think importantly in this book, what we wanted to mark is we have at times where learning becomes an important center of what's happening in higher ed. And for those of us in the field, we think it's a little bit odd that we then turn away from that, or we forget that we need to spend that time and that investment. So the ultimate goal of this book is to try to keep our eyes on that center, to keep our attention, keep our institutional attention, keep our cultural attention on this idea that we're here to help our students. We're here to help in the classroom. Everything else, while important and crucial and necessary, is in many respects in service of this idea that we're here to teach our students.
You know, I realize this may be stating the obvious, but could you just go a little bit deeper in terms of why a turn to learning is so, from your vantage point, why is this so important? What's the impact and for whom?
Sure, I can take a shot at this. It's a great kind of question, and to make this very concrete, Eddie and I, we graduated from college in 1991 and 1990, and we've now worked in higher education. And we were talking about, Melissa, for your daughters and my daughters who went through college, we both have daughters who are in their mid-20s. Eddie's kids are in high school now. How much better the college experience was, the teaching was, the learning was, than when we were undergraduates. And almost all the story about higher education is, quite rightly, how much more expensive it's gotten. And we always talk about that, and the growth in debt and all the issues of access. We always talk about all the problems, but we hardly talk about how something as fundamental as teaching and learning has very much improved in higher education. We've seen real advances. And Eddie and I, we wanted to both mark that and actually say that out loud, that colleges and universities are really investing in teaching and learning. It might be uneven, and it might be there's lots of differences, but we're seeing all these investments. And then to try to step backwards and unpack why that's happening. And for, as Eddie says, to make sure that we don't backslide, to make sure that we actually celebrate and understand what's working in making institutional investments in teaching and learning beyond what the individual professor can do in her classroom, and actually how the institution can support her in her teaching. And that's what we're trying to figure out and make recommendations for in the book.
That is such an important point, but this is not something that is noted very often, that kind of a shift. So that's an important value, I think, in the writing that you're doing. Eddie, were you going to say something?
Yeah, I was just thank you for that, Melissa and Josh. That's a great answer. I think we maybe two other sort of things that are part of this conversation for us. One is we know a lot more about how people learn than we might have known 30 years ago. We were starting to see, I think, changes in how people were teaching in pockets in different departments, for example, at certain institutions. When I was trained to be a teacher as a graduate instructor in a writing program, there was a lot of attention being paid to pedagogy at that moment in time, but it was very, very isolated to that program, and certainly wasn't institution-wide. And then it certainly wasn't across all of our institutions in any sort of way. And over the past 30 years, we have learned quite a bit more about what it means to learn, what students in a classroom, the value of cognitive models, apprenticeship models of learning, various approaches to active learning that become really important. There's so much more we know about what can be impactful for our students. And so that's one important piece of this. This is why this sort of attention is crucial, I think, from our perspective. And the second is that we just know that the job of teaching right now is perhaps more difficult because of that, but also because of technology and where our students are in relationship to technology. So we ask a lot more of our faculty, and in some ways, what we ask of our faculty requires more institutional support than ever. It requires more engagement with the classroom technologies. It requires more development of materials in a digital format, because we're no longer just handing out textbooks or books for students to read. All of that active learning, all of that engagement with some of the things we know from learning science and from the scholarship teaching and learning, helping us see that there are better ways of engaging with students. I mean, there's more work required from a faculty perspective to do that, which inevitably means that there are more hands involved in the teaching and learning experience. It means that there are more people other than just the faculty member working with a number of students. And when you recognize that, you realize that the institutional engagement with that, the institutional investment in that, needs to be on par with what you're asking of your faculty, needs to be on par with what you hope to bring to your students. And that's a challenge, right? So we know more about learning science, and we know that the job is a little bit more complicated and more challenging and requires more help and support. And both of those things, I think, are part of that reason for that turn.
Well, and that is a great segue to my next question, because I know that you have written, I believe it was in your first book, that we actually know quite a bit about how learning works. and the application of that learning and learning science to the practice of teaching, but that there's less known about learning innovation. Can you say a little bit more about what you mean by that? And in particular, for those that aren't familiar with the term, what do you mean when you use the words learning innovation? Let me just have you start there.
Sure. So we think about learning innovation as those intentional practices that are done at the institutional or organizational level to advance student learning. So we're really trying to bring this out of what individual professors do, the craft of teaching, which is completely necessary, and then look at all the structures and the supports that those professors can access, tap into, integrate into to help advance their students' learning. We argue in that first book that we see how institutions are approaching advancing individual student learning as an area that should be researched, that it's very much under-theorized and under-researched. We don't have enough comparative data about what colleges and universities are doing, what's working and what's not. And we really see this as a discipline that can bring in elements of organizational change. There's lots of writing about how universities and organizations change, but not so much trying to apply that to the issue of student learning. Eddie, you want to add on to that definition?
I think it's a great definition, Josh. Thanks for laying that out. I mean, I think, related to that and what I was saying earlier about what we know about learning, right? There's an odd sort of tension there that we know a lot about what can be effective practices in the classroom. We don't yet know everything we need to know or what we can know about the practices at an institutional level that we need to engage in. We don't really fully understand what will be most effective and helpful. So a lot of what we're doing is innovating in practice, what I call here applied innovation. So I see the work that I do in that kind of space where it's aspirational. And so the learning innovation that we're talking about in the book is very much about how to mark those relationships between what's happening in the classroom and what's happening at the institutional level.
Yeah, thank you for that. Now, in your second book, which I think was written in the middle of the pandemic, it was written after the pandemic, right, had taken off. You present 15 possible scenarios for how a college or university might plan for institutional and instructional resiliency. Obviously, the book was inspired by the pandemic, but it really strikes me that the framework that you present serves an even more valuable purpose now in going forward as presidents and deans and provosts and faculty are trying to figure out what the new normal looks like, if there is such a thing. So for listeners who haven't read your book, can you provide a high-level overview of the framework that you present with these 15 scenarios?
Yeah, happy to. And you're absolutely right. So this was written, in fact, just as institutions were going fully remote. So we wrote a series of, wrote one major blog post where we actually outlined all 15 scenarios, and then we cataloged all of those over the next 2 weeks plus, where we were really trying to help folks who were at institutions thinking about how do we not only think about this moment in time right now when we're going into an emergency remote mode, but what will the fall look like when we don't actually know what's going to happen from the pandemic at the time. So if you remember back, it was a lot of anxiety about where we would be, what would happen in the fall, would we be back on campus, would the pandemic keep us completely? There was some assumption, I think, that we would have some choice in that, but that choice would be, I think, affected by different rates of infection and so on, things that we still were not clear about. So the range of scenarios were things that required some presence on campus to being fully remote, but they were more in the hybrid kind of space where we would imagine that we would be on campus, but we need to be able to adjust quickly. We need to be able to think differently about the time where students would have to be present on campus because they might get sick or faculty might get sick. And so we mapped out a set of moments from being fully remote and fully online to being fully in person and kind of back in a kind of normal space, and everything in between. We just tried to give examples of possibilities that people could think about. We were thinking both in terms of what would happen in the classroom, so different ways in which faculty could engage with students, to what might be some structural changes, so different ways of thinking about how the semester was in fact laid out. So you might start early and end early, you might start late and end late, you might move to a modular approach to the curriculum, so you could actually have more intense periods and then give students breaks. It really was not at the time clear what would happen in the winter, which we all thought was going to be the next sort of big wave. Turns out for most of us, it happened in the fall, and we all had to go fully remote. But this was really very much about trying to get us set up for possibilities for that fall.
We wrote this while we were trying to figure all this out at our institutions and to advise, leadership about where to go, and our colleagues at the as well as across the ecosystem. So we were trying to develop frameworks and language, so everyone was working with a consistent set of language, at least when they talked about what are the possibilities. I do want to say that one of the things we highlight in the book with each of the scenarios is that as the pandemic was going on, we were very much seeing that the pandemic had unequal effects on different types of learners, that the least privileged of our learners were having the biggest difficulties navigating the pandemic. It was clear that our colleges were doing a great job of keeping going, of having academic continuity, but that many of our learners, those with not good access to good bandwidth or quiet places to study, crowded living environments, parents who are ill, poor economic circumstances, we're actually having a really horrible time, and the pandemic was hitting our student population unequally. So in the scenarios, we try to really focus on issues of equity, and that as institutions try to go forward with strategies to deal with this public health emergency, how can we actually set things up that work for the least advantaged of our learners?
I'm wondering if you're thinking, I'm sure your thinking has changed at least a little bit since you first put pen to paper and came up with these 15 scenarios. So based on what you're now seeing and your sense about where we are, where most colleges and universities are, would you change the framework, the continuum in any way?
When we put down these scenarios and we drafted out what we saw as the set of possibilities, we didn't see these as rigid, dogmatic scenarios or structures, but rather really as speculative ideas about how one might think about changes to the semester, changes to engagement with students. And as Josh was saying, we were seeing equity issues. We were seeing also a disconnect from our students. Our students were shutting down. There was a lot of despair, a lot of anxiety about what was happening in the world. It wasn't just COVID. We had a political situation. Everything was sort of piling on to our sense of students. And so what I like about what we put together and feel proud about is that we were creating a kind of loose framework that could be mixed and matched. That could be, you could take ideas from any one of them and say, okay, you know what, I don't really like scenario 2, but what I do like is a piece of this scenario 2 and some of 3 and some of 5. And that at least gives me an idea how to think about it within the context that we are writing about. So I don't know that I would change anything. We tried to make that sort of sense of mix and match as clear as possible, but that might be one thing where we might be a little bit more clear about what it means to pull from different pieces, especially as we think about what kind of influence this might have going forward.
Well, and the benefit in terms of optionality and flexibility that your framework helps to inspire, in thinking about possibilities is really, it's I think a really valuable aspect of the tool. Josh, anything that you would add to the framework now or change?
I think I'm most thinking about how do we retain what we learned during the height of the pandemic when we had to go remote, and incorporate those learnings into what we're doing going forward. It was an absolutely horrible time, and there's not a horrible time for our students, for our faculty and our staff. It was, you would not wish this on anyone. It was also true that for a span of time, all of our the only thing that our institutions were focusing on was having our students be able to go through their courses and their programs and progress, towards their degrees. Normally at universities, we're focused on 1,000,001 things, and at universities like Eddie and my institutions, we have a teaching and a research mission, a knowledge production and a teaching mission, and we do 1,000,000 other things as well. But for a time, we were all just really focused on how can we support our students through this really difficult time? How do we support our faculty and all the people working together? So, going forward, I think that maybe, in your question, what would I do differently? I'm wondering if we should be really pushing these ideas more, that we have to retain that kind of focus and maybe give some other things up.
Yeah, that's a really good point. You're really talking about the most significant takeaways, what we learned, right, from COVID, the experience in COVID. So what other takeaways? And I think you talk about this in your book as the legacy, the teaching and learning legacy from COVID. So being focused, laser-like focus on student success, helping students be successful and achieve. But what other significant things would you want to make sure get pulled forward?
So I think that if I could take a stab at this, I think the answer that Josh gave earlier about what we were learning about our students, we saw into our students' lives in ways that we had never done before, and our students saw into our lives in ways that they hadn't before. And I think that created a sense of community that was, crucial and important. And I don't want to lose sight, even in saying that it wasn't that shared sense of community then made everything better. In fact, it didn't. I think it helped to ameliorate some of the challenges that we were facing, but it certainly didn't, I think, solve the challenge. And we know that we still have inequities in higher education that put our students at a disadvantage for doing their best work. And so I think one of the things that, I would hope we would see is that an investment in trying to understand how we bring our students into our community and help them feel like they belong in a way that allows them, encourages them, gives them the context and the platform to do their best work is maybe one of the most important things we can do in higher education. Sometimes that's making sure that their bandwidth works, but often that is about helping our students in their differences feel included in the environment that we're in. We saw during the pandemic that an institutional context could be a particular kind of leveler. It gave everybody a certain access to resources and bandwidth and all of the technologies and so on. But we also know it creates difference as well, and it creates disparities as well. And so trying to address those, I think, are important. On the flip side, I would say one of the things that that we spent a lot of time on at my institution, and I think I was certainly thinking about as we were writing this, is trying to be as flexible and as compassionate to our students as possible at a really, really difficult moment in time. And I think one of the places where we did not communicate well enough, that flexibility and compassion do not always mean not being rigorous, do not always mean not asking a lot of our students, not giving them structure. You can give structure and then be flexible with structure, or you can be completely flexible, and then that puts a lot of the pressure back on our students. So one of the things I think we need to learn is how we approach that initial moment in the pandemic with certain expectations about what our students needed at the time. And we've learned things. We learned that some things worked and some things that needed be refined. And one of those in my mind is that relationship between flexibility and compassion and rigor and expectation of our students, giving students, especially students who may be the most vulnerable, a structure can be one of the best things we can do for them, and then be flexible. One of the pieces in this that we talk a lot about is this idea of transparency and really sharing what we're doing and why we're doing it. That can be really valuable at this time as well. So a lot of the scenarios that we put together were as much about trying to be transparent with our students, including our students, bringing our students in, helping our students be partners in the process. And that dynamic, I think we lose really, really fast when we go back to where we are now, which is trying to be back on campus in most of our, the institutions that we teach in, and we have colleagues in mostly residential institutions where we're expecting our students to be in place. We lose that sense of what it means to really kind of fully embrace some of the lessons of the past 2 years. And that's, I think, really disappointing. And I would just go back to the first book as well, that institutional investment, it's easy to pull back on that and think, okay, we made it, we're through, and we're done. But there's so much more that needs to be done. And this is a kind of practice and process that we always need to keep our eyes on.
Yeah. No, I couldn't agree more with that. And I hope that your future writing will keep these things front and center. As I said, your scenarios are, I think, more needed now than ever before. So let me ask you, do you have a favorite scenario of the 15? And do you have any thoughts about which ones you think are most likely to stick as we are moving forward?
So I'll be a little provocative. Right now, so I'm the director of online programs and strategy at Dartmouth. I think about online all the time. But my favorite scenario is everyone comes back to campus and we're only residential and we get rid of all the technology. Now that's never going to happen, right? It's not like the world now is a blended and a hybrid world, and we're working hybrid and our students have a lot more flexibility. But the whole thing that the pandemic taught me is how much I miss just sitting around a table and having no technology at all. It's such a privileged place. It's not the world we live in. But I'd say if I could sort of wave my magic wand, we'd just all be around a nice wooden seminar table.
I think Josh has waved his magic wand. I think most people want us to be back in that place, and that's kind of where everyone is going. Since the sort of mid part of the pandemic, I've been thinking that one of the things that we're going to be doing is the pendulum is going to swing back really, really hard against remote learning, and everyone's going to want to be on campus. And I do see it as a pendulum. I think it's going to have to swing and level at some point and find some balance. But right now, we're pretty hard in that space of being back on campus, at least for institutions that are traditionally residential and have in-person instruction. I think for me, I'll name a scenario, and then the reason why. The modified tutorial is one that I always kind of come back to, because for me, it's the one that is really the most invested in the engagement between the faculty member and the students. It's the one that tends to allow for the most transparency between the faculty member and the students. It's the one that gives the most care to and builds on what we know is most important in almost every experience in higher ed, and that's these mentoring relationships where students can see themselves in a faculty member as someone who is carrying out a career or a set of principles and thought that they would ultimately like to do themselves. And I think that the tutorial model at some level allows for at least some engagement with that mentoring practice and process. But to me, really, the issue is not about what the scenario is as much as how do we build the practices of helping the faculty member make and bring students in to be partners in the learning experience, helping them faculty understand the value of being transparent in what they're trying to do. So often when we're teaching, we're simply going in and trying to impart information or practice, but really understanding the why of both of those things, why we make the choices we make, why we're doing what we're doing in a syllabus, in the way that we're teaching a particular topic or set of issues. Those moments can be the ones that actually give the foundation for the thinking that we're asking our students to do. And we don't tend to do that enough, I think.
So from your vantage point, what does the future of higher education look like? So we just have a few minutes left here, so I want to ask you to look into your crystal ball and tell me what you see looking ahead and what you think the implications are for teaching and learning.
So I'll go first here to give Eddie a little chance to say his wisdom to this. And by the way, when Eddie and I talk about this, and we always argue, like that's what's so great about our partnership is we're always arguing this out, and we seldom agree, but that is very helpful in a partnership. I mean, I think it's clear that we're never going back to having this strong divide between an in-person and a digitally mediated course or class or field of study, that everything now is integrated, flexible, hybrid, just the way we work now. You know, we spend some time going to the office, sometimes working, at our houses. Sometimes a lot more of us are working fully remotely. It's just all mixed up. It's not the most important dividing line now of where we're doing that work. I think higher education is definitely going towards that, how people who work at colleges and universities work and how teaching and learning works. So we're never going back to it's just about the campus.
My sense of where we need to go and what we need to be doing is preparing for the unknown. And that's a hard thing to do. You obviously don't want to just set up a set of institutional structures that are waiting for something that won't come. But to recognize that there are things that we can do to prepare us for challenges that we are going to face, to be agile, to be ready to pivot and move as we can. And that's a hard thing for our institutional structure right now, or the way in which we tend to be set up. Organizationally, we tend to have, on the administrative level, I think maybe the same kind of problem that we have on the academic level, and that is we are siloed in disciplines on the academic space. For the most part, they're interdisciplinary programs, but often we're in schools or in disciplines within those schools. And on the administrative side, we do the same thing. We create these spaces that are trying to solve one type of problem, rather than recognizing that in order to be agile and be ready for the things that are coming down the road, we need to have a lot of cross-institutional pollination to recognize that the centers and the spaces that are doing a particular kind of work need to work together, not in the emergency mode, but in the mode that allows them to build knowledge, to build understanding, to build practice and process. So when things do go wrong, or things are become challenges, or there is a change in higher ed, we can be responsive to that without saying, we're all caught in our own little spaces and wondering, what we're going to do at this particular moment in time. That's a hard thing to do. It requires thinking differently about kind of an institutional structure that almost everywhere is pretty rigid in many respects. And it's hard to see a lot of people, a lot of senior leadership at the institutions trying to think differently about their overall institutional structures in that way.
Well, as you both know, changing the structure is one of the first ways that a president can get fired. So I know that there is a lot of reluctance, particularly when you're new in the role, to start moving people around. And yet, what you're saying is a theme I have heard across so many conversations we've had in the last year with thought leaders from a variety of different spaces in higher ed. And they're all talking about this, the need to move out of silos and do a lot more cross collaborative thinking and planning. So, I think you're identifying something that is very, very important, and maybe it has to start somewhere other than from the top. Which, again, is I think why the work the two of you are doing is so valuable, because you're cross collaborating across institutions, which is, that's something else that we need to do a lot more of. So, to the question of what other things presidents should be doing, let's say the two of you are invited into a gathering of 300 college presidents, provost, deans from across the country, and you've been asked to advise them on what they should be thinking about, what they should be doing in terms of teaching and learning on their campuses to ensure a more robust and equitable experience for their students. Do you have a few tactics or strategies that are top of mind, other than what you've mentioned a few, but I'm wondering if there's anything else you would advise if you had this ready audience in front of you.
Well, first I want to say that my bags are packed. I'm ready to go with that invitation. I hope it comes. I'm waiting by the phone for that call. And it'll be great to hear what Eddie says here. As we have these conversations, this is the kind of work that we do to think about the research that and writing we do together. So Melissa, this is a fantastic conversation. You asked great questions. Thanks. Mm-hmm. I think if I had some time with presidents, I would talk about learning science. I would say that we really have to organize our institutions around what we know about how people learn and use those as first principles to guide our organizational structures. So I would want to have many more learning scientists brought into leadership roles at our institutions.
Mm. Yeah, this is a really great question, and it's a hard one to answer. So I'm happy to pack my bags too and join Josh in this conversation. But I think that, one thing that just a couple of things that come to mind that I think are important to pay attention to. One, at least at institutions like ours, the incentive structure for faculty to pay attention to teaching is just completely out of sync with the incentive structure to pay attention to research. And so rethinking that incentive structure across the board, I think, becomes really important. What do we value? Why do we value it? What are we asking our faculty members to do to pay attention to? And how do we think about making sure that promotion and tenure and the practices that we've constructed in institutions to support our faculty are aligned with an investment in teaching and learning? So the second is really making sure that the institutional infrastructure is in place to think about teaching and learning across all aspects of the institution. Right now, I think we probably have at many institutions so many offices and senior leadership positions that are driven by academics, primarily meaning research, that are driven by services, student supports, sports and athletics, finances. We have very little at senior levels, at provostial levels or vice president levels, or places where we actually are invested in teaching and learning. So we don't have that kind of institutional investment in these issues. So I would say that that's the second thing. There needs to be a clear investment in that work at the institutional level that it helps everybody see that this is important. And that is part of that kind of that structural shift, which I would say is the third thing, really. So how do you start to see the investment in this work that's happening on the administrative level as parallel to the investment that we make on the academic level? Because that is what is going to shore up and make sure that what we're doing in the classroom is as impactful as possible. We just, I think, fundamentally have still bought into this tension between administration and faculty. And it's a tension that I think if the 300 presidents and provosts in this room could imagine helping to address and resolve, it would be fundamentally about saying that we're actually here with the same mission, the same values, the same goals, and we need to recognize that we each bring a piece of the solution to this conversation, to this work, and we need to work together in order to make that more effective and more valuable. And there are things that each one of us can learn from each other in that space, and that's just, I think, a lot of places not happening in the ways that it needs to.
I sure hope you get that invitation soon. This is a great conversation, and it's one that does need to be happening at the highest levels of our institutions. So here is the final question. This is our signature question we ask all of our guests in season 4. What innovations, new ideas have captured your thinking these days? Is there something that has just caught your imagination?
And this is one of the areas that Eddie and I debate all the time. So what's caught my attention is the idea of trying to bring quality relational-based education to scale. That can you actually have the kind of education that Eddie and I love the most, that we love to students, we love to teach, where you actually build a relationship with your learners, much in the way, Melissa, your daughter built a relationship with faculty at Georgetown, a personal relationship. That's the most wonderful thing. but it's very expensive, right? It's a small ratio of learners to faculty, and the faculty are just amazing. It's not a very scalable type of model. Are there ways that we can find to use what we know about learning science, what we know about technology, what we know about maybe artificial intelligence, all those kind of things, to integrate those to try to scale that intimate relational way of learning? I'm kind of maybe optimistic about trying to run at this. I'm also more optimistic than Eddie is at working with companies to try to do this, and Eddie is definitely more skeptical, or I'm more curious about that. But that's the big challenge that it's kind of like, I think of it like self-driving cars. That's where I'm thinking about it. Eddie?
That's great, Josh. I certainly don't quibble with the goal. I don't know how we get there, but I love that. I love the idea. I think one of the things that it's not really an innovation. I'm not sure I have an innovation that I look at and say this has really captured my thinking in the maybe more traditional sense of an innovation. But what I have become fascinated by over the past 10 years is the way in which at an institutional level we collaborate with other institutions. And we have long done that at a disciplinary level. It's one of the wonderful things about higher ed. I think it's actually what gives us our resiliency as an industry. We don't compete in the way that most industries compete. We collaborate on maybe the most important things, even as we compete for things like students and rankings and all of the least important things in terms of our engagement. We all want to teach our students. We want our students to be the best they can be. That competition is probably the least important thing that we do. But we collaborate on knowledge creation. We collaborate on research. We collaborate on the things that have been kind of one of the cornerstones of higher ed. And we have done that less on the teaching and learning side. And we're doing it a little bit more. And we're starting to see things in communication happening that allows us to see some value in doing those kinds of things. I don't think it's enough. I don't think we're quite there yet. I think the MOOCs, again, the innovation in my mind wasn't, are we teaching at scale? The innovation was people are all of a sudden talking about something that is about teaching and learning across institutions, sharing ideas. It involves many other innovations, big data, technology, and it certainly involves the kind of cost models that Josh is interested in, I think, when we start to talk about scale. But we're not quite there yet, and we haven't, I think, fully kind of played out that innovation.
Okay, well, thank you for those thoughtful and provocative responses. So before we end, is there anything you want folks to know about what you're working on or what we can be on the lookout for? I think you said at the outset that you have some new writing that may be coming.
We do. Yeah. Thank you for that question. And thank you for this conversation. It's been really wonderful. It's been a few months since we've had a conversation like this together. So I really appreciate the opportunity to do so. Always love connecting with Josh and being able to share ideas in this kind of space. So we have 2 books that are in process right now. We have a collection of essays that we're working on with a colleague of ours, Maggie Tibelius, and that book it's called Recentering Learning, and it's fundamentally about some of the things and lessons that we both learned during the pandemic, but we're really about what it means for higher ed to kind of really continue to put at the center the notion of teaching and learning. And then Josh and I are working on a book as well, and that book is titled How Universities Learn, and it's really trying to track and understand what it means for the kind of institutional change that we're talking about to happen, how it's happened in the past, and what it might mean for us to understand the change that could happen in the future as well.
Oh, that sounds wonderful. So those are both going to be very valuable additions to the literature and to the thinking that you are both in the middle of inspiring. So thank you so very much for this conversation. I've thoroughly enjoyed it, and I know that our listeners will as well, and they will take a lot away in terms of the insights that you have shared.
Thank you, Melissa. Wonderful conversation.
Yeah, thank you, Melissa.